It all started with tiny things, small, almost imperceptible details that didn't seem significant on their own. But bit by bit, they started painting a picture I couldn't ignore. Jessica, my wife of 7 years, had become different. It was subtle at first, a certain shift in her habits, her energy. But soon, it felt like she was slipping away, like her mind was drifting somewhere I couldn't reach. Jessica and I had built a life together that was, at least from the outside, picture perfect. We had 2 beautiful kids, Ella, our lively 5-year-old, and baby Sam, who had just turned 8 months old. Our life looked pretty ideal to anyone who saw us. Jessica was dependable, the backbone of our family, and she loved being a mom. But lately, things were off, and while I told myself it was probably nothing, a gnawing doubt had begun to set in. Little things kept cropping up that I couldn't ignore. Sometimes she'd leave her phone screen facing down, a new habit. She started slipping out of the room to take calls, and whenever I asked who was calling her at odd hours, she'd wave it off, saying it was just work stuff. One Friday night, after a long week, I asked her about it, but she just shrugged and mumbled something about an important project. It made sense, and I wanted to believe her. Then, one evening while Jessica was getting Sam settled for bed, her phone buzzed on the counter beside me. Without really thinking, I glanced at the screen, just out of curiosity. A text preview glowed from someone saved simply as D. The message read, "Can't wait for tomorrow. Miss you already?" My heart stilled, and I quickly looked away, half wishing I hadn't seen it. Miss you already? That wasn't something you'd expect from a coworker. I told myself I was jumping to conclusions, but the doubt had already taken root. That night, we sat on the couch together watching TV. I wanted to ignore what I'd seen, but I couldn't shake the thought. So, as casually as I could, I brought it up. "Hey, someone named D texted you earlier," I said, keeping my tone light. "They sounded pretty excited about tomorrow." For a split second, her expression shifted. It was so slight, I nearly missed it, a tiny flicker of discomfort. Then she laughed, a little too easily, and brushed it off. "Oh, that's just Danny from work," she said, waving her hand. "He's kind of overly friendly, always chatting about random stuff." I forced myself to smile, to let it go, but my mind wouldn't stop racing. Danny from work? Since when was there a Danny in her life? Jessica was never one to make fast friends at work. In fact, she'd often tell me about how she liked to keep things professional. I reminded myself I was probably reading too much into it. But the idea stuck with me, and over the next few days, I found myself analyzing everything. The next morning, Jessica left the house early, saying she had to meet her team at a coffee shop downtown. I could picture her sitting across from this Danny, laughing and leaning in just a little closer than necessary. The thought made me sick. But I told myself I was being ridiculous. There was no way Jessica would ever, would she? Later that night, Jessica came home, her face flushed and smiling as she showed me some photos of the meeting, colleagues at a table, coffee cups in hand, all looking completely innocent. I smiled and tried to play along, but a part of me couldn't ignore the little thrill she seemed to have carried home with her. She'd started dressing up more for work, too, adding small touches like lipstick and a dash of perfume. Nothing drastic, but noticeable. I found myself complimenting her more often, half hoping she'd smile back at me with that old familiar warmth. But instead, she'd nod, almost distracted, like her mind was miles away. Then came the night when she told me she'd be working late. Jessica didn't get home until after 9 p.m., well past the kids' bedtime. She climbed into bed beside me, gave me a quick kiss, and turned away, falling asleep in seconds. But I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that I was losing her. The next morning, Jessica got up early, saying she wanted to go for a run. I watched her lace up her shoes, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the old Jessica, the one I fell in love with. But then she picked up her phone, glancing at it with a little smile, before tucking it into her pocket, and jogging out the door, disappearing down the street and into the morning mist. It was then that I realized I couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. I needed answers. No more wondering, no more wishing it was nothing. I had to know if Jessica was slipping away, or if my whole life was about to change in ways I never expected. A few more days passed, and I tried my best to shake off the feeling, convincing myself that I was just being paranoid. I wanted to be wrong so badly, to believe that Jessica was just going through a busy season at work, or maybe dealing with some personal stuff she hadn't shared with me. But everything about her behavior seemed off. The way she'd pull her phone close whenever a notification came through, the way she'd drift off during our conversations, her mind clearly elsewhere. Even when she was at home, she seemed like she was a million miles away. Then came the night that shattered any hope I had left of this being a misunderstanding. Jessica was out again, this time for an office dinner she'd said was being held in the next town over. She mentioned she might be late, so I put the kids to bed by myself. As I sat in the quiet of the living room, I kept checking my phone, watching the clock tick later and later. The hours dragged on, and still, there was no sign of her. When she finally did come home, it was almost midnight. She walked through the door with a lightness in her step that struck me as unusual. She was smiling, her cheeks flushed in that way that reminded me of our early days when we'd sneak out of the house just to grab a midnight drink at the lake. As she slipped off her shoes, I felt a pang of jealousy, like she'd been reliving those memories without me. "How was the dinner?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Oh, it was fine," she replied, brushing it off as though it was nothing. "Just the usual work stuff. A bit boring, honestly. But I couldn't let it go." "You were gone a long time for something boring," I said, attempting a light chuckle to cover the strain in my voice. She glanced at me, her expression unreadable. "They wanted to go out after, have a few drinks. I didn't want to be rude, so I stayed." She shrugged, as if this were completely normal, as if she'd done this 100 times before. I nodded, forcing a tight smile, but inside, I was fuming. She'd stayed out all night for the sake of not being rude. Since when did Jessica care that much about drinking with coworkers? She'd never been that person, and she'd definitely never been one to prioritize nights out over time at home with us. I wanted to press her further, to ask who she'd been with and why she seemed so energized, but I swallowed the questions down. I knew I'd sound possessive, like some overbearing husband who couldn't trust his wife to go out for one night. But as she went upstairs, I couldn't let go of the suspicion. I went back to sit in the living room, in the dark, replaying everything over in my mind. I didn't know how long I sat there before I finally gave in and reached for my phone. My hands were shaking as I pulled up Jessica's phone carrier app. I knew it was a breach of trust, that even looking was wrong. But I needed to know. The call log loaded slowly, the seconds stretching like hours, and then there it was. Just as I'd feared, she'd been texting with D a lot. There were dozens of messages back and forth, especially around the time she'd been at the office dinner. I could feel my stomach twist with each one, even though I couldn't see the contents of the messages themselves. But the sheer volume was enough to make my blood boil. The texts were all between her and this person, no other coworkers, no casual chats with friends, just this D, who had somehow become the center of her attention. The next day, I couldn't focus at work. My mind was fixated on what I'd seen. I tried to think of any possible explanations. Maybe this person was just a friend, someone she could vent to, someone who happened to be filling a gap I hadn't realized was there. But even as I told myself these things, I knew they were just weak excuses to avoid facing the obvious. I knew deep down that this was something more than friendship. No friend would be the only one you text at all hours of the night. That evening I confronted her, trying to stay as calm as I could. "Hey Jess," I started, keeping my voice casual as we cleaned up after dinner. "This D person you've been talking about, who is he really?" Her hand froze for a moment as she wiped down the counter, but then she forced a laugh. "Just a guy from work, like I said. He's new to the team, and I've been helping him get adjusted." She looked up at me, her smile almost too perfect, as if she'd rehearsed the response in her head. New guy, huh? I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Seems like you two have been talking a lot for just a friendly welcome. She shrugged, avoiding my gaze. You know how it is. New job, new responsibilities. Sometimes, it's just easier to connect with people who get the stress. I nodded, but her explanation did nothing to calm me. In fact, her evasiveness only added fuel to the fire. And then, almost as if fate had decided to intervene, her phone buzzed on the counter between us. She reached for it quickly, but not before I saw the name light up on the screen. D. My heart pounded as she glanced at the message, then set the phone face down without a word. I didn't need to see the message itself to know it wasn't work-related. The look on her face, the slight smile that lingered just a little too long, it was all the confirmation I needed. Jessica quickly excused herself to check on Ella, who had started fussing in her room. As soon as she was out of sight, I reached for her phone. I knew the passcode by heart, and my hands trembled as I unlocked it, scrolling straight to the messages. The last exchange was simple but damning. Last night was amazing. I miss you. The words blurred as my anger bubbled up, my mind racing through 100 different thoughts, 1,000 feelings of betrayal. The life we'd built, the family we'd created, it all felt like it was unraveling in front of me. I put the phone down quietly, letting it settle on the counter like it was something fragile, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. By the time Jessica returned to the kitchen, I was gone, sitting in the dark on the back porch, my mind an empty shell. I didn't know how long I sat there, only that the air was cold, and I felt even colder inside. Jessica slipped into bed without saying a word, like nothing had happened. But in that moment, I knew that everything had changed. And there would be no going back. After that night, the house felt different. There was a strange, unspoken tension between us, like a fine thread that held the illusion of normalcy but felt ready to snap with the slightest pull. I kept replaying those messages in my head. Last night was amazing. I miss you. No matter how much I tried to rationalize or make excuses, those words were seared into my mind, a constant reminder that Jessica wasn't just mine anymore. Someone else had slipped into my life and was stealing my wife right under my nose. A few days later, Jessica reminded me that my birthday was coming up. She suggested a small family celebration. Something low-key. She kept it casual, almost as if she was hoping it would distract me, that a pleasant night would erase all of my suspicions. I agreed, though not for the reason she probably thought. I wanted to see her, to watch her that night. I wanted to know if she could really look me in the eyes and celebrate with me, knowing what she was doing behind my back. As the day approached, I found myself growing more nervous than excited, and by the time my birthday arrived, I was barely holding it together. Jessica had gone all out with decorations, strung up streamers, and even gotten my favorite cake, which felt like a twisted kind of irony. She walked around the house all day as if she had nothing weighing on her, even teasing me about the big surprise she had planned for later that night. I had to force myself to smile and play along, my stomach churning at the thought of what her surprise might actually be. Finally, that evening, she told me to go outside with the kids, who were bouncing around with excitement. She was preparing the final touches inside, and I had to admit, it felt a little like the old days, our family, together, laughing and playing in the backyard. For a brief moment, I could almost convince myself that things were normal, that my suspicions were just figments of my imagination. But then, I noticed Jessica's phone on the counter, lighting up with a new message. She'd left it unlocked, probably expecting me to be too distracted with the kids to even look. But curiosity got the better of me. I slipped back inside and glanced down at the screen. The message was from D, and my blood ran cold as I read the words. Happy birthday to him, huh? See you soon. Can't wait. My hands clenched the edge of the counter, my heart pounding as the reality sank in. My wife was planning to meet him tonight, on my birthday, in our home, with our kids under the same roof. The audacity, the sheer disrespect of it all, left me reeling. I stood there in shock, my mind spinning with questions and fury, my fingers itching to throw her phone across the room. But I forced myself to stay calm. I needed to know what was coming next. I stepped back outside, closing the door quietly behind me as if nothing had happened. I couldn't let her see me unravel, not yet. Ella and Sam ran up to me, excited for cake and presents, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in their father's chest. Jessica followed shortly after, her face glowing with a smile I knew wasn't for me. She held my hand as we blew out the candles together, her fingers warm and soft against mine. The moment was supposed to be perfect, but all I felt was a deep, sickening anger. After we put the kids to bed, she told me she'd be back in a bit. She needed to grab something from her car, she said with a coy smile, and it hit me like a sledgehammer. This was it, the big surprise. She wasn't just stepping out to get something, she was going to meet him. And I was supposed to sit there, like a fool, waiting for her return. As she left, I followed her from a distance, watching her walk across the yard, her steps quick and eager. She didn't know I'd seen the message. She thought she was in control, pulling the strings in some twisted game she was playing. My heart thundered in my chest as I watched her disappear into the night, heading toward the car parked a few blocks down the street. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to see for myself. I grabbed my coat and slipped outside, keeping far enough behind that she wouldn't notice me. My stomach twisted with each step as I followed her down the street and around the corner, stopping just before I reached the lot where she had parked. I watched as a familiar car pulled up beside hers, a car I knew well. My brother David. My vision blurred, my chest tightening as I watched him get out of the car, a grin on his face that made my blood boil. Jessica glanced around, her eyes scanning the street as if she knew this was wrong, as if a part of her still cared about hiding it. But then she stepped into his arms, and any last hope I had died right there. She pulled him close, pressing her lips against his, and I felt my heart shatter into pieces I knew would never fit together again. I stayed hidden, my hands shaking, my mind reeling with disbelief. David, my brother, my own blood. He was supposed to be family, someone I could trust. And there he was, with his arms wrapped around my wife, on my birthday, laughing like he hadn't just ruined my entire life. The betrayal cut so deep I felt like I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with memories. David had been close to us for years. He was the fun uncle who made the kids laugh and helped out whenever he could. He'd always been a bit of a free spirit, the kind of guy who coasted through life, charming everyone he met. I'd brushed off his flirtations, his careless attitude, chalking it up to his personality. But this was something else entirely. I didn't move, didn't breathe as I watched them whisper to each other, their faces too close, too comfortable. I was rooted to the spot, trapped in the silent horror of my own life unraveling. The betrayal wasn't just from Jessica. It was from David too, the one person I'd never expected to hurt me like this. They parted after a few minutes, with Jessica promising she'd see him soon. As she headed back toward the house, I slipped away, my mind a whirlpool of rage, disbelief, and pain. How long had this been going on? How many lies had they fed me, right to my face? The question seared through me as I made my way home, slipping back inside before she did, trying to act like nothing had happened. When she returned, she gave me a lazy smile, pretending she'd just been out for a moment. She sat next to me on the couch, as if nothing was wrong, as if our life hadn't just been torn apart by her hands. I didn't say a word, didn't even look at her. I just sat there, numb, my heart aching with the weight of her betrayal. It wasn't just the affair that crushed me. It was the coldness, the way she could lie so easily, the way she could sit beside me like we were still the same couple we used to be. I knew then that my life would never be the same. And for the first time in my life, I truly understood the meaning of hate. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Jessica curled up beside me like she hadn't just shattered every ounce of trust I'd ever given her. Every time I closed my eyes, the image of her and David flashed in my mind, her smile, his hands on her waist, the way she glanced around, pretending to care about getting caught. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my breathing, wondering how I'd missed it all, how I hadn't seen the signs that were now so blindingly clear. By morning, I'd come to a decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to confront her blindly, giving her the chance to twist her way out of it. No, I needed to be smart, to gather proof, to make sure that, when the time came, there'd be no excuses, no denials. I was going to catch them red-handed and make them face what they'd done. But I knew it wouldn't be easy. Jessica was careful, precise, almost meticulous. She was hiding her tracks well. And David, he was equally cunning, maybe even more so. I couldn't help but wonder how long this had been going on. Had they just started? Or had it been months, maybe a year, of secrets and stolen moments? I spent the next few days observing her every move. I tried to act normal, to keep things as they were, but it took every ounce of willpower I had. Jessica was good, better than I'd expected. She'd act loving when the kids were around, play the perfect wife when I was watching, but I could see the cracks, small as they were. The way she'd slip away with her phone, the way her eyes flicked toward her screen when a message came through, her quick glances toward me to see if I noticed. She was covering her tracks, but not as well as she thought. The hardest part was keeping up appearances for Ella and Sam. They didn't know what was happening, and I didn't want them to feel the tension that was simmering under the surface. So I played along, forcing smiles, helping with bedtime stories, pretending to laugh at the same shows we always watched together. But inside, the anger and pain were tearing me apart. Then, one evening, while Jessica was taking a shower, I saw my chance. She'd left her phone on the dresser. My hands shook as I picked it up, quickly scrolling through her recent messages. It was risky. I knew I didn't have long. And then I saw it, the thread between her and David. There it was, plain as day. My own brother's name in the message history, along with weeks' worth of texts. Some were casual, friendly even, but then there were others, texts laced with secrets and innuendos, talks of mischances, and needing more time together. One message in particular stopped me cold. "We should plan something big soon. Maybe next weekend?" Her reply was almost immediate. "Can't wait. This time, let's make it perfect." I stared at the words, feeling a white-hot rage simmering beneath the surface. They were planning a whole weekend, right under my nose. I could barely see straight as I put the phone back, rage and disbelief clouding my mind. She stepped out of the bathroom a few moments later, oblivious to what I'd just read. She gave me a quick smile, drying her hair like everything was fine. The next day, I took matters into my own hands. I needed solid evidence, something undeniable that she couldn't explain away. I bought a small recording device and set it up in the living room and another in the bedroom, hidden well out of sight. I knew Jessica's patterns. She'd take calls when she thought I wasn't around, often in those very rooms. I figured it was only a matter of time before I'd catch her red-handed. Over the next few days, I could feel the tension building. Every time she left for work, I wondered if she was really going to the office or if she was meeting him. I started checking her location on my phone's shared tracker, watching her dot as it moved through the city. Sometimes she went straight to work, other times she'd take detours, stopping in places I didn't recognize, areas I couldn't pin down. And every time, my mind went to the worst place, imagining her and David laughing, holding hands, mocking me behind my back. Finally, the weekend came. Jessica told me she'd be working late on Friday night, and would probably stay over at a friend's, since it was close to her office and they'd have a few drinks after work. Her lie was so smooth it nearly fooled me. But I wasn't the same trusting husband anymore. I knew better. She left just after dinner, giving me a quick peck on the cheek and a reminder to tuck the kids in. I watched her go, pretending to look distracted by a game on TV, but inside I was fuming. This was it, the moment I'd been waiting for. I gave her a head start, waiting nearly half an hour before slipping out myself. I knew where she was going. The tracker on her phone was still active, leading me directly to her location. I drove through the city, following the blinking dot on the screen until I reached a small, upscale hotel on the other side of town. Her car was parked out front, and as I pulled up, my heart was pounding, each beat louder than the last. I could feel the betrayal building up like a tidal wave, crushing me from the inside. I waited in my car, hidden a few rows over, my mind reeling at what I was about to see. Just when I thought I couldn't take it any longer, I saw them. Jessica and David, walking out of the lobby together. They were laughing, their faces lit up, completely oblivious to the pain they were causing me. I felt my stomach churn as I watched her slip her arm around his waist, leaning into him as if he was her husband, as if I didn't exist. And the worst part? They looked so comfortable, so at ease, like this was something they'd done 100 times before. I raised my phone, my hands shaking as I took pictures. I wanted proof, something concrete that I could use when the time came to confront her. But each click felt like another stab to the heart, each image a piece of evidence of the life she'd hidden from me. I watched them walk into the hotel's bar, laughing and sharing drinks, completely at ease in their twisted reality. I sat in my car for hours, watching as they came and went, capturing every moment, every stolen glance, every kiss they shared when they thought no one was watching. Finally, as the night wore on, they disappeared up to a room, leaving me alone in the dark, my phone filled with photos I wished I could erase. I drove home, my mind numb, my heart feeling like it had been crushed. Jessica hadn't even bothered to text me, to check in on the kids, to make sure everything was fine. She was completely wrapped up in her own world, leaving me to pick up the pieces. When I got home, the house was quiet, the kids asleep. I sat in the dark, trying to process everything I'd seen, but the pain was too much. My life, the life we'd built together, felt like a cruel joke, a lie that had been stretched too far. I knew that this couldn't go on. I couldn't keep pretending, couldn't keep letting her play me like a fool. But I wasn't done gathering evidence. Not yet. I wanted to know every detail, every lie she told, every moment she'd shared with David behind my back. And when the time came, I'd make them both face the consequences of their betrayal. The weight of everything I'd seen was crushing me, but I kept going. I told myself I had to endure it for the sake of finding out the full truth. For the next week, I kept up my routine, acting as if nothing was wrong, as if I wasn't tormented by every glance Jessica and I shared, every lie she told without flinching. I'd watch her make breakfast for the kids, laughing like she was the perfect mother, and all I could see was her and David in that hotel, completely unbothered by the family they were ripping apart. The more I watched, the clearer it became, this wasn't just a fling. This was something serious, something that had been going on far longer than I could stomach. I started putting together a timeline in my mind, piecing together every suspicious thing I could remember, every moment when she'd seemed distant, every work dinner she'd been late to, every time she'd slipped out of bed with some excuse. And it was as if my mind were untangling a hidden truth I'd missed all along. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, she casually mentioned that she'd be heading out of town for a business conference. She'd be gone for 3 days, she said, leaving me to handle the kids and everything else at home. My blood boiled at the audacity. She hadn't even tried to disguise her plans with David as anything else, just dumped the responsibility on me without a second thought. "Are you sure it's just a conference?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She looked at me, her face neutral, though I could tell she was assessing my expression. "Yeah," she replied lightly. "I'll be staying with some people from work. It's nothing exciting, trust me." I nodded, pretending to accept it, though the truth was starting to eat me alive. I knew this conference was her way of slipping away for another rendezvous with David. I let her go that night, though I knew it would be the last time I'd ever pretend to believe her. The next morning, I made up my mind. I called a private investigator, someone discreet, someone who could get me all the proof I needed without tipping Jessica off. When I explained the situation, he agreed to start immediately, following her as she left for the conference. I didn't know what else to do. I'd spent so many sleepless nights chasing the truth, I couldn't let this chance slip away. I needed someone to catch every detail, every moment of betrayal, so that when the time came, she wouldn't be able to deny a single thing. The investigator's updates came in quickly. Within hours, he'd confirmed my worst fears. Jessica hadn't gone anywhere near a conference. She'd taken the freeway out of town, not to the city, but to a small cabin rental just over the state line, a secluded, romantic spot tucked away from any chance of being discovered. When he texted me the address, my stomach turned as I realized just how far she'd gone to cover up her affair, to make it feel as real and as private as possible. Then the real bombshell hit. After the investigator had trailed her for a few hours, he texted me a series of photos, each one worse than the last. They showed Jessica and David together at the cabin. And not just that, they looked relaxed, comfortable, like a married couple spending a weekend retreat together. The intimacy, the casual affection in every photo was gut-wrenching. They weren't hiding, weren't sneaking glances over their shoulders like it was some cheap fling. They were acting like they belonged there, like this was their life. One photo in particular tore me apart: Jessica, holding David's hand, guiding him through the doorway of the cabin, her face glowing with a warmth I hadn't seen in years. It was like she had transformed into someone I didn't recognize, a stranger who no longer had any trace of the woman I married. And David, he wore that same smug grin, that carefree look I'd seen so many times. He had stolen my wife, my trust, and had the audacity to look happy about it. I was so sickened that I nearly called her right then, nearly let loose all the anger I'd been holding back. But the investigator's final report stopped me cold. It turned out this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment affair. Jessica and David had been renting that cabin for months. The investigator had managed to pull up the property's booking history, and I nearly passed out when I saw how long it had been going on, a full year. For 12 long months, my wife had been sneaking off with my brother, lying to me, pretending our life was real while slipping away to spend weekends with him. The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. A year. My mind spun, remembering every lie she must have told, every holiday, every birthday we'd spent together while she'd been planning these secret getaways. It felt like my entire life had been hollowed out, like everything we'd shared was a cruel joke. And David, he hadn't just betrayed me once. He'd been lying to me every time we'd seen each other, every time he'd laughed with my kids, every time he'd shown up at my door pretending to be my brother. I sat in silence that night, staring at the ceiling, my heart hollow with the weight of everything I'd learned. A full year of deception, of lies so deep and woven into my life that I didn't know where to start. It was almost like they'd taken pleasure in it, like hiding it had been part of the thrill. And the worst part was the creeping suspicion that maybe even my kids weren't safe from this betrayal. I couldn't push the thought away any longer. Luke, my 8-month-old son. I couldn't help but think back to those nights when Jessica had left right after his birth, claiming to be too stressed, needing to clear her mind. The way she'd seemed withdrawn, distant, right when we should have been happiest as a family. The more I thought about it, the more doubts started to form in my mind. What if Luke wasn't mine? What if all this time, Jessica and David had been hiding an even deeper secret, one that changed everything I thought I knew about my family? I had to know. I couldn't live with the uncertainty. So, the next day, without telling Jessica, I took Luke in for a paternity test. I didn't want to believe that Jessica could betray me on such a profound level, but I also couldn't ignore the signs. She and David had been seeing each other for at least a year, and Luke was only 8 months old. The timing was painfully close. The wait for the results was agonizing. I went through the motions at home, pretending everything was fine, keeping up appearances for the kids, but inside, I was unraveling. Jessica acted like nothing was wrong, humming to herself as she went about her day, occasionally texting smiling to herself whenever she thought I wasn't looking. The anger burned in me like a constant flame, but I forced myself to hold it back. Soon I'd have the proof. Soon I'd know the full extent of what they'd done. And finally, the results came in. The call from the clinic was quick and emotionless, just a doctor confirming what my gut had been telling me all along. The voice on the other end of the line said the words I'd been dreading to hear: Luke wasn't mine. The DNA test had confirmed it. My son, my beautiful little boy, the one I'd cradled, the one I'd promised to protect, was actually David's child. I stood there, the phone cold in my hand, the room spinning around me as the truth sank in. My brother and my wife had been lying to me on a level I hadn't even imagined, hiding the fact that they'd created a child together, letting me raise him, bond with him, believing he was mine. The rage inside me exploded into a hollow, empty pain that cut deeper than anything I'd ever felt. As I hung up the phone, I knew there was no going back. They'd taken everything from me, my marriage, my family, even my trust in my own blood. And now that I knew the truth, I knew exactly what I had to do. Finding out that Luke wasn't mine, that my own brother was his father, was the hardest thing I'd ever faced. Every time I looked at him, I felt a brutal mix of love, betrayal, and heartbreak. He was innocent in all of this. He was just a baby. But knowing that every smile, every tiny hand reaching for mine, every coo and babble belonged to a child I had been deceived into thinking was my own, it was shattering. Jessica and David had robbed me of my right to know the truth from the beginning. They had used me, letting me play the role of father without a second thought. They had taken everything that mattered to me and made it a lie. That night, I sat alone, reeling from the truth that had torn my family apart. I was filled with anger and helplessness. How had Jessica managed to live with herself for all these months, hiding such an enormous lie? And David, my own brother, he had been a part of this charade, showing up with gifts for the kids, playing the perfect uncle, all while knowing he was Luke's real father. It was twisted beyond belief, a betrayal that cut so deep it felt like a wound that would never heal. I knew I couldn't confront Jessica until I had a plan. She'd spun such an elaborate web of lies that simply exploding in anger wouldn't be enough. I wanted her to feel the consequences, to see the wreckage she and David had left in their wake. So I took my time, quietly preparing. I collected every message, every photo, every scrap of evidence. I knew that one day, soon, she'd have to face all of it. In the meantime, I had to keep up the act. Every day, I pretended for the sake of the kids. I didn't want Ella to sense anything was wrong. She was only 5, too young to understand the chaos lurking beneath the surface. And Luke, he was still a baby, innocent in all this, and I couldn't help but love him, even as my mind raced with the reality of his parentage. But Jessica, she was different. Every time I looked at her, I felt the weight of her betrayal, like a cold hand tightening around my heart. One evening, I sat across from her at dinner, watching her laugh at something Ella said, and I could barely stand it. The sight of her, so carefree, so relaxed, after everything she'd done, it was infuriating. I kept my face neutral, nodding along as she told me about her day, but inside, I was boiling. How could she act so normal? How could she look at me, look at our family, and pretend like she hadn't torn it apart? As she cleared the table, her phone buzzed, and her face lit up with a quick, familiar smile. I knew that smile well by now. It was one she only wore when she thought of David. She glanced at me, but I looked away, feigning distraction. I didn't want her to see the disgust I felt. A few nights later, I overheard her on the phone with him. She'd snuck out to the back porch, thinking she was being discreet, but her voice was just loud enough for me to catch snippets of the conversation. "I know, I miss you too. It's just so hard with everything going on," she whispered, her voice soft, almost pleading. "But we'll be together soon, don't worry." I felt my fists clench involuntarily as I listened. The audacity, the nerve of her to talk to him so freely in our home, after everything they'd done. I wanted to storm out there, grab the phone from her hand, scream that I knew everything, that the charade was over. But I held myself back. It wasn't time yet. Over the next few days, I threw myself into preparing for the inevitable confrontation. I reached out to a lawyer, explained the situation, and laid out my plan. I showed him the evidence I'd gathered, the texts, the photos, the paternity test. He reviewed it all, nodding grimly as he flipped through the files. "You have a strong case here," he said, his voice filled with quiet sympathy. "When you're ready to file for divorce, she won't have a leg to stand on. Custody, assets, everything. You're doing the right thing, but I can't imagine what you're going through." I thanked him, though his words felt hollow. Doing the right thing was cold comfort when I thought about what I was about to put my kids through. Ella was a daddy's girl, she'd feel the separation the most. And Luke, my chest tightened at the thought of him. What would happen to him when the truth came out? He might never know me as his father. All of it hurt in ways I couldn't put into words, but I knew it was inevitable. Jessica and David had left me no choice. Then came the night I decided to put my plan into action. Jessica was heading out to meet David again, saying she was working late at the office, her lies as smooth and practiced as ever. I kept my face calm, giving her a small, detached smile as she kissed me goodbye, her hand lingering on my shoulder in a way that felt so strange now. I could hardly bear her touch. The moment she was out the door, I called David. He answered quickly, his voice light and carefree, no doubt expecting it to be Jessica. "It's me," I said, my tone cold. There was a pause, and I could feel his shock through the phone. Hey, man. What's up?" he asked, his voice strained. "I know everything, David. I know about you and Jessica, about Luke. I know the whole twisted story." He didn't speak for a few seconds, and then he let out a shaky breath. "Look, I can explain." "Save it," I cut him off. "I don't want to hear your pathetic excuses. I just want you to know that you're done. Both of you. You think you can just steal my life, raise your child in my house, under my nose? Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Mark, please," he stammered, his voice desperate now. "It was a mistake." A mistake?" I spat, my anger finally breaking free. "This wasn't a mistake, David. This was deliberate. You came into my home, sat at my table, pretended to be family, and all the while you were with my wife. Don't insult me by calling it a mistake." There was a long, tense silence before he finally whispered, "I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't. I never meant to hurt you." The apology was as hollow as I'd expected. I ended the call, my hands shaking with rage. The damage was done, and nothing he could say would ever make it right. But I wasn't finished yet. Jessica came home late that night, her face flushed, her smile just a little too bright. She slipped off her coat, acting like she'd had a busy, exhausting evening. But I couldn't keep up the pretense any longer. I stood up, motioning for her to sit down at the dining table. "What's going on?" she asked, her tone wary as she took a seat. I placed the stack of evidence in front of her, the photos, the messages, the paternity test results. She stared at them, her face draining of color, her hands trembling as she flipped through each page. I could see the horror dawning in her eyes, the slow realization that I knew everything, that her lies had finally come crashing down. "Mark," she whispered, her voice breaking, tears already streaming down her face. "Please. I can explain." "Explain?" I said, my voice ice cold. "Explain how you've been lying to me, betraying me, sneaking around with my own brother? How you let me believe Luke was mine?" "Go ahead, Jessica, explain." She sobbed, her words jumbled and frantic, but I couldn't hear them. Every tear, every apology felt like another lie. I'd seen her with David, had seen the way she looked at him, the way she held him. Her tears meant nothing to me now. They were the tears of someone who'd been caught, not someone who was truly sorry. "You destroyed our family," I said, my voice choked with the weight of everything I'd held back. "You and David, you've taken everything from me. I can't ever forgive that." As I walked out of the room, leaving her there to face the wreckage she created, I knew there was no going back. My life, my trust, everything I'd once believed in, it was all gone, left in ruins by the two people I'd trusted most. But as painful as it was, I knew one thing: I would never let them hurt me again. Jessica's sobs echoed down the hall as I left her sitting alone at the dining table, her face pale, her hands clutching the stack of evidence like it was her lifeline. I could still hear her voice, desperate and pleading, calling my name as I walked away, but I refused to turn back. I felt hollow, drained of every emotion except for a deep, bone-chilling anger. She'd crossed every line, and there was nothing left for us to salvage. That night I slept on the couch. Well, slept is a stretch. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every lie, every hidden moment, every whispered conversation I'd overheard between Jessica and David. It was as if my mind refused to let it rest, the betrayal sinking deeper into me with each passing hour. I could hear Jessica moving around upstairs, her muffled sobs drifting down the staircase, but I didn't care. This was the bed she'd made. She could lie in it alone. The next morning, I got up before the sun rose. I made breakfast for the kids, kissed Ella on the forehead, and rocked Luke gently in my arms, my chest aching with a mixture of love and sorrow. He wasn't my biological son, but he didn't know that. He looked up at me with innocent, trusting eyes, and I wondered how I could ever bring myself to explain the truth to him. How would he feel, knowing he'd been born from betrayal? Knowing the woman who was supposed to be his mother had lied about his very identity? Jessica stayed upstairs, hiding in our room, probably trying to piece together an excuse, an apology, something to make me reconsider. But it was too late for that. I'd already made my decision. By the time she finally came downstairs, I was packing a bag for the kids. I didn't want them in the house while I finalized everything with my lawyer, and Jessica didn't even try to stop me. She just stood there, watching with red-rimmed eyes as I gathered their things, her face etched with guilt. "Mark, please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Can we talk about this?" I looked at her, the woman I'd spent the last 7 years of my life with, the mother of my children. Or at least, that's what I'd thought. The sight of her made my stomach turn. "Talk about what, Jessica?" I said, my voice cold. "What's left to say?" Her lips trembled as she tried to hold back more tears. I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It was just... Just what? I interrupted, the anger finally breaking through. A mistake? A moment of weakness? You were with him for a year, Jessica. A year. You lied to me every single day. You let me believe Luke was mine, knowing he wasn't. How do you even begin to explain that? She fell silent, her face crumbling as she tried to find the right words. But there were no right words. There was nothing she could say that would change the fact that she'd destroyed our family, that she'd betrayed me in the most unforgivable way possible. I finished packing the kids' bags, my movements stiff and robotic, my mind racing as I tried to hold myself together. "I'm taking them to my parents for a few days," I said finally. "I need time to think, to figure out what happens next. And I don't want them here while we do that." Jessica's face fell, but she didn't argue. She just nodded, her shoulders slumped as if the weight of her actions had finally come crashing down on her. I left her standing there, silent and broken, as I loaded the kids into the car and drove away from the house that had once felt like a home. The drive was quiet, Ella asking where we were going while I tried to answer as calmly as possible. She was too young to understand, but I did my best to reassure her, telling her we'd be visiting her grandparents for a little while. When we arrived, my parents welcomed us with open arms, their faces warm and kind, a comfort I hadn't realized I needed. I couldn't bring myself to tell them everything, not yet, so I kept my explanations brief. They didn't press me, sensing that something was deeply wrong, but respecting my silence. Over the next few days, I focused on the kids, throwing myself into taking care of them, keeping them happy and distracted. Ella spent her time playing with her cousins, while I looked after Luke, cradling him as he slept, my heart aching with a sense of loss I couldn't shake. He felt like my son. He was my son, even if the DNA test said otherwise. I'd loved him from the moment he was born, had bonded with him in a way I never thought possible. But now, every time I held him, I couldn't escape the painful reality that he was the product of Jessica and David's lies. Finally, after days of deliberation, I called my lawyer. I went through every last piece of evidence, explaining the situation in painstaking detail, as he took notes, his face impassive but sympathetic. "There's no way she'll fight this in court," he said, nodding slowly. "Not with everything you've got. You'll have full custody of Ella, and we can petition to maintain your parental rights with Luke, but that could be complicated, given the paternity results." I'd expected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt like another knife to the chest. Jessica's actions had robbed me of my right to be Luke's father in every way that mattered. It wasn't fair, and it wasn't something I could ever forgive her for. The next day, I returned to the house alone, leaving the kids with my parents. I didn't want them to see what was about to happen. Jessica was there, sitting at the dining table, looking lost and empty, like a ghost of the woman I'd once loved. She glanced up when I entered, her face crumpling as she saw the expression on mine. "I talked to my lawyer," I said coldly, placing the divorce papers on the table. "You can either sign these now, or we can go to court. Either way, it's over." She looked down at the papers, her hands trembling as she reached for them. "Mark, please, can't we at least talk about this? For the kids?" "The kids?" I repeated, my voice laced with bitterness. "The kids you lied to, the kids you nearly destroyed by carrying on this twisted affair with my own brother? You don't get to pretend you did this for them." Her face contorted with guilt, but she didn't say anything. She knew there was nothing she could say that would make it right. As she signed the papers, her tears staining the ink, I felt a sense of finality wash over me. This was the end of us, the end of everything we'd built, everything I'd once believed in. I gathered the signed documents and turned to leave, but as I reached the door, she called out to me. "Mark," she whispered, her voice choked with desperation. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I just need you to know that I loved you. I really did. This was never about not loving you." I paused, a hollow laugh escaping my lips. "If that's what you call love, Jessica, then I don't want any part of it." With that, I left, closing the door on the life we'd once shared, on the family we could have been. I drove back to my parents' house, numb but resolute. I knew it would take time, that the road ahead would be painful, but I was done being a victim of her lies. I'd find a way to rebuild, for Ella, for Luke, and for myself. But as I pulled into the driveway, a strange calm settled over me. It wasn't closure, nothing about this situation could be truly closed. But it was a start. A start at a new life, a life free of the lies and betrayals that had haunted me for too long. And though the scars would remain, I knew that, in time, I'd heal. Because in the end, I hadn't lost everything. I still had Ella, I still had Luke, and I still had the strength to move forward. And that was more than Jessica or David could ever take from me. The weeks that followed were hard. The pain of betrayal stayed with me like a wound that refused to heal, and it was the quiet moments, the empty space where Jessica used to be, the echoes of our past life, that hit me the hardest. But every day, I pulled myself together for Ella and Luke. They were innocent in all this, and I was determined to make sure they felt safe, loved, and protected. I'd finally told my parents everything, and while the shock on their faces mirrored my own initial disbelief, they supported me without hesitation. They helped with the kids, making sure they stayed busy and happy while I put my shattered life back together. Every so often, I'd see my father clench his fists when he thought I wasn't looking, or my mother's eyes well up with unshed tears, but they never let their anger or sorrow show around Ella and Luke. They knew, as I did, that the kids needed stability, not more upheaval. Jessica had moved out immediately after the divorce papers were signed, and our lawyers were sorting out the custody details. Legally, I knew that Jessica still had rights as Luke's mother, but I was fighting for primary custody of both children. I wanted to be the one they looked to for safety, the one who would always put them first. With my lawyer's help, I pushed for every legal advantage I could, filing evidence, paternity results, everything that proved she was unfit to be the parent they deserved. But even as I focused on securing a future for Ella and Luke, something else lingered, a thought, small and insistent, that wouldn't go away. Look. Though I knew he wasn't my biological son, my heart had already claimed him. I was the only father he'd known. I had rocked him to sleep, been there for every milestone, cherished every smile and laugh. And the idea of him ever finding out the truth one day, of him realizing that his mother's betrayal was the reason for all the brokenness around him, filled me with dread. How could I tell him the truth? How could I explain the twisted reality of his origins without breaking his heart? So, I made a decision. Luke was my son. No matter what the DNA test said, no matter what Jessica and David had done, I would raise him as my own. I would be his father, even if he wasn't biologically mine. He deserved that security, that love, and I would never take it away from him. Then one day, Jessica requested to see the kids. Despite everything, I knew I couldn't deny her that right, at least, not legally. But I set strict boundaries, arranging for a supervised visit at my parents' house. I didn't want her alone with them, didn't want her trying to spin the situation in her favor or filling their heads with lies. When she arrived, she looked like a shadow of herself, thinner and paler, with dark circles under her eyes. I could see she was nervous, her hands shaking slightly as she reached for Ella and Luke. Ella greeted her with a hesitant hug, but Luke was more reserved. At his age, he didn't understand what was happening, but he could feel the tension, and he clung to me, unsure of what to make of the stranger in front of him. Jessica's face crumpled when he wouldn't come to her, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. She had made her choices, she'd brought this on herself. I watched as she sat with them, trying to play, trying to act like nothing had changed, but the kids sensed it. Ella was quiet, glancing over at me as if to check whether it was okay, and Luke, he kept reaching for my hand, wanting reassurance. Jessica finally looked up at me, a desperate plea in her eyes. "Mark," she whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear. "Please, can we talk?" I shook my head. "There's nothing left to say." She stared down at her hands, looking utterly defeated, but I wasn't moved. I stayed close to the kids, offering them the stability and comfort that Jessica's presence seemed to disrupt. When the visit ended, Jessica left without a word, her face etched with sorrow, but it meant nothing to me. She had lost her place in our lives, and it was a price she would have to live with. That evening, as I tucked Ella into bed, she looked up at me, her big, trusting eyes filled with questions. "Daddy, why doesn't Mommy live with us anymore?" The question I'd been dreading. I took a deep breath, brushing her hair back gently. "Mommy made some choices that hurt us, sweetheart. She loves you, but sometimes things change." Ella looked sad, but she nodded, sensing more than I could explain. I kissed her forehead, lingering a little longer, promising myself that I would never let anything hurt her again. I had no control over Jessica's choices, but I could control the life I built for Ella and Luke. The weeks passed, and I started piecing together a new routine for us, filling our days with normalcy, stability, and laughter. Ella adjusted quickly, finding comfort in the familiar routines with my parents and me. And Luke, he didn't know the difference, thank God. To him, I was just his dad, and that was all that mattered. Then one night, as I was getting ready for bed, my phone buzzed. It was a message from David. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen, my blood boiling just from the sight of his name. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to pretend he didn't exist. But the anger simmered, and before I could stop myself, I replied, "Fine. But make it quick." We met the next day at a small park on the edge of town. He looked as wrecked as Jessica had, but I felt nothing as I watched him approach, his face etched with guilt and desperation. He'd betrayed me on a level I could barely comprehend, and I didn't think anything he had to say would change that. "Mark," he began, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I know sorry doesn't even come close, but I need you to know I regret everything." I folded my arms, my gaze cold. "Regret? Now you regret it?" He looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I made a mistake. I let things get out of control, and I didn't stop it when I should have. But Mark, I never wanted to hurt you." I laughed bitterly. "You didn't want to hurt me? Then why did you do it, David? Why did you sneak around with my wife? Why did you let me believe Luke was mine?" He winced, the weight of my words hitting him like a punch. "I don't know, okay? I don't have an excuse. I was selfish, and I got caught up in it. I thought I could keep it separate, that you'd never have to know. But I did find out." I snapped, my voice filled with rage. "And you didn't just betray me, David. You betrayed your family, the people who trusted you most. You took everything from me, and for what? A secret, stolen affair?" He nodded, swallowing hard. You're right. I messed up. But I want to make things right, at least for Luke. I want to be in his life, Mark. I know it's a lot to ask, but he's my son too. The words hit me like a gut punch. For a moment, I felt the same rage, the same betrayal flare up, but I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. You gave up that right the day you decided to betray me. Luke doesn't know you, and he doesn't need to. I'll raise him. I'll give him the stability he deserves, not the chaos you and Jessica created. David's face fell, but he didn't argue. He knew he didn't have a leg to stand on. I understand, he said finally, his voice filled with defeat. I know I've lost any right to be in your life or his. I didn't reply. I just turned and walked away, leaving him standing there in the park, alone with his guilt. It wasn't closure, not really, but it was as close as I would ever get. As I drove home, a strange sense of peace settled over me. I didn't have all the answers, and I knew the road ahead would be tough. But I had the kids, my family, and the strength to keep moving forward. And in that moment, that was all I needed. The confrontation with David left me drained, but it also solidified my resolve. I'd told him that he would never be part of Luke's life, and I meant it. He made his choice when he betrayed me, and that was something I could never forgive or forget. I wouldn't let his actions ripple any further into my kids' lives, into our future. The next morning, I reached out to my lawyer, explaining that I wanted to pursue sole custody of Ella and Luke. I knew it would be a fight, but I was prepared to do whatever it took. Jessica tried to contact me a few times after our last conversation, but I ignored her. My lawyer advised against cutting off all communication, reminding me that the courts might still grant her visitation rights. But I was determined to fight for full custody, even if it meant reliving every painful detail of what she and David had done. Despite everything, life with the kids started to settle into a new routine. Ella was adjusting well, though she asked about Jessica sometimes, her little mind trying to make sense of it all. I kept my explanations simple, telling her that Mommy had some things she needed to work out, but that she loved her very much. It was painful to see her struggling with the change, but I knew it was better than letting her live in a home filled with lies and betrayal. Luke, thankfully, was still too young to understand, though he'd cling to me a bit tighter at bedtime, like he sensed I was his anchor in the storm. Then, one evening, as I was putting the kids to bed, my lawyer called with an update on the custody proceedings. He told me that the paternity test would likely work in my favor for keeping Luke, despite the lack of biological ties. Because I'd been raising him since birth and was listed on his birth certificate as the father, the court would consider me his primary parent. The relief was overwhelming. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a glimmer of hope. But with that relief came a new weight. I realized that, one day, I'd have to tell Luke the truth. He would find out eventually, and when that time came, he would need to hear it from me, not from anyone else. The thought haunted me, but I put it away, focusing on the present and the responsibility I had now. I would cross that bridge when the time came. One morning, my mother suggested we take a short vacation, just a weekend getaway with the kids, something to help us all reset. She'd found a cozy cabin by a lake where we could fish, hike, and spend some quality time together. It sounded perfect, exactly what we needed to escape the heaviness that had been hanging over us for too long. We packed up and drove out of town early on a Saturday morning, the kids chattering excitedly in the back seat as we wound our way through the hills and forests. The cabin was even better than I'd imagined, nestled among tall pines, with a dock leading out onto the water. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. Being out there, away from everything, it was as if the weight of the betrayal, the anger, the hurt, they all felt a little lighter. Over the next 2 days I watched as Ella laughed and played, as Luke toddled around, trying to keep up with his sister, his laughter filling the air. I hadn't realized how much we all needed this until I saw the smiles on their faces, the ease in their laughter. My parents were right. It was a reminder of the life I wanted for them, free of the shadows of betrayal. One night after we'd put the kids to bed, my mother and I sat on the porch, the cool night air filled with the sounds of crickets and the gentle lapping of the lake. She turned to me, her eyes filled with a warmth and understanding that only a mother could give. "You're doing well, Mark," she said softly, reaching over to place a comforting hand on mine. "I know it's been hell, but you're a good father, and you're giving them everything they need." I looked away, feeling the weight of her words. "I hope so, Mom. I'm trying, but it's hard. I keep thinking about Luke, and how one day he's going to learn the truth. He'll find out that David is his biological father, and I don't know how I'm supposed to tell him that. I don't know how he'll react." She squeezed my hand gently. "When that time comes, he'll have had years of your love, your guidance. He'll know who his real father is, biological or not. And he'll understand that you chose to be there for him, to raise him, no matter what the test results said. That's something that will stay with him forever." I let her words sink in, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She was right. Luke would know who was there for him, who loved him, who raised him. And that bond would matter far more than biology. The rest of the weekend passed in a warm, healing blur. We fished, roasted marshmallows, and spent hours by the lake, just being a family. By the time we returned home, I felt stronger, ready to face whatever came next. The peace and laughter from the weekend stayed with us, lingering in the quiet moments, giving me the strength to keep going. Back at the house, I picked up where I'd left off, working with my lawyer to finalize the custody arrangements. Jessica continued to request visits, but I kept them limited, insisting they be supervised and brief. She hadn't fought me yet, but I could tell the reality of the situation was hitting her. She was losing her place in the kids' lives, and she had only herself to blame. And then, just when I thought things were finally starting to settle, I received a letter in the mail. It was from David. At first, I considered tossing it in the trash without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. I unfolded the letter, scanning the first few lines, my stomach churning as I read his words. "Mark, I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything, but I need you to hear me out. I'm leaving town. I can't stay here, not after everything that's happened. I've ruined our relationship, and I know I can never repair the damage I've done to you or the kids. But before I go, I want to tell you something I should have told you long ago." I stopped, my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to expect, but whatever it was, it couldn't be good. I continued reading, feeling my anger grow with every line. "Jessica and I started seeing each other before Luke was born, but it wasn't just a fling. She told me that she felt trapped, that she needed something more. I know it sounds selfish, but we thought we were in love. We convinced ourselves that we could make it work. But we were wrong. And now, I've lost everything because of that lie." The words blurred as I tried to process them. All along, Jessica and David had told themselves they were in love? That it was worth tearing apart our family? I felt sick, a fresh wave of betrayal and anger washing over me. I shoved the letter back into the envelope, clenching my fists as I struggled to contain the rage building inside. Leaving town, running away, he thought that would make up for what he'd done. That he could just walk away and leave me with the mess he'd created? But then, a sense of relief settled over me. Maybe him leaving was for the best. Maybe his absence would be the final step in letting me rebuild my life, a life free from the toxic betrayal he'd left behind. It wouldn't erase the pain, but it would give me a chance to truly move on. Later that night, I burned the letter in the fireplace, watching the flames consume his words, turning them to ash. This was my chance to let go, to start fresh, to reclaim the life he and Jessica had tried to steal from me. With David gone and the custody case finally drawing to a close, I knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was mine to rebuild. And this time, I would do it right, for Ella, for Luke, and for myself. With David gone and Jessica's presence fading from our lives, a strange calm settled over the house. The custody arrangements had been finalized. Ella and Luke were both legally in my care, with Jessica granted only limited, supervised visitation. It was the best possible outcome under the circumstances, a new beginning that felt bittersweet but necessary. As the days passed, I threw myself into making life feel as normal as possible for Ella and Luke. I repainted the kids' rooms, bright colors they'd chosen themselves. We spent evenings reading stories, playing games, and finding joy in the little things. It was as if we were learning to laugh again, to reclaim the simple pleasures that had once filled our lives. Jessica had called a few times, leaving messages I didn't respond to. I'd made it clear that I was focused on the kids, on giving them stability. If she wanted to rebuild her life, she'd have to do it without me. She had shattered my trust, and there was no going back. But her messages grew increasingly desperate, and one day, she showed up on my doorstep, her face pale and anxious, looking like a shell of the woman I'd once loved. "Mark," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted to see the kids." I took a steadying breath, not allowing her expression to sway me. "You know the arrangement, Jessica. We stick to the schedule. That's what's best for them." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. She was clearly struggling, but this was a result of her own choices. "I know, but I just wanted to talk to you, to explain." I cut her off, keeping my voice firm. "There's nothing left to explain. You've already said everything I needed to hear. I've moved on, and you should too. For the kids' sake." She looked down, tears filling her eyes. "I know I can't fix this. I know I hurt you in ways I'll never be able to undo, but I'll always love you, Mark. I wish things had been different." For a moment, there was silence. The weight of her words hung in the air, filling the space between us with a sadness that was both familiar and foreign. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that there had been some part of her that had once truly loved me. But it didn't change anything. She'd made her choice, and I'd made mine. "Goodbye, Jessica," I said, my voice steady but final. She nodded, a defeated look in her eyes, and turned to leave, her figure disappearing down the street. I watched until she was out of sight, feeling a sense of closure settle over me. Over the next few months, our little family continued to heal. Ella adjusted well, her laughter filling the house, and Luke became more confident, his trust in me growing with each passing day. My parents were a constant support, stepping in whenever I needed a break or a helping hand. They were my rock, my reminder that, despite everything, we still had a family. One afternoon, as I watched Ella and Luke play in the backyard, a strange feeling washed over me, a sense of hope I hadn't felt in a long time. We'd been through so much, had faced the betrayal and pain, and yet here we were, still together, still laughing, still moving forward. I realized that, as much as Jessica and David's actions had broken me, they hadn't destroyed me. They hadn't taken everything. I still had my children, my parents, and my own strength. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself looking toward the future, thinking of the life I wanted to create for Ella and Luke. I knew there would be challenges ahead, that raising them as a single parent would come with its own set of difficulties. But I was ready to face them. I was ready to build a life filled with honesty, love, and integrity, the kind of life they deserved. One evening, as I tucked Luke into bed, he looked up at me with his wide, innocent eyes and whispered, "Daddy, you'll always be here, right?" I felt a lump rise in my throat, but I nodded, my heart swelling with love. "Yes, buddy. I'll always be here. No matter what." He smiled, snuggling deeper into his blankets, his tiny hand reaching out to hold mine. In that moment, I felt a warmth and contentment that no betrayal could take from me. I'd found a new purpose, a new strength, and a future that, while different from the one I'd once imagined, was still mine to build. The darkness that had haunted me for so long had finally begun to lift, and as I sat by Luke's bedside, watching him drift off to sleep, I knew that we were going to be okay. We were going to make it. In the end, I'd found something that Jessica and David had never truly understood, a love that was stronger than betrayal, a bond that nothing could break. I would raise Ella and Luke with every ounce of love and dedication I had. They were my children, my heart, and my future. And that was more than enough. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, hit like and leave a comment with your favorite part. We'd love to hear your perspective.